Hi everyone, today we're going to be looking at English Language Paper 1 and looking at some tips for success. We've spoken to some examiners, we've looked at the examiners' reports and our own experiences to try and come up with the best sort of strategies and approaches for approaching this paper. So just as an overview, you've got only 5 questions, remember, same as paper 2. The mark distribution on this is slightly different though. So you've got 4 marks for comprehension, 8 marks for language, 8 marks for structure, 20 marks for evaluation and 40 marks for creative writing. Okay, and we're going to look at each of those questions in detail now. Question 1 is your list 4 things question. So your question will focus on the opening of the text and you'll be given a specific number of lines. The main reason people drop a mark on this section is that they don't answer from the lines that they have been given. So the most important thing is making sure that you're really clear on that. I always say take a highlighter into this exam and identify the different sections you have to write about for different questions. So you need to show you understand the text and can select information. So if you're quoting, keep it short. If you're just doing a massive long quotation of 5 or 6 lines, that doesn't say that you can understand the text. That says you're just copying it out, at which point we wouldn't award the marks. Good practice is to start each line with the subject. So for example, if the question is tell me 4 things, list 4 things you know about Jane, you would say Jane is 1, Jane is 2, Jane is 3, or if it's list 4 things about the setting, you could say the weather is this, the landscape is this, da, 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 da. So just to show that you are really paying attention. And really key is don't overthink it. Don't bother with this means or this suggests. You don't need to interpret, you don't need to infer, you don't need to analyse. That's just wasting your time. Keep it simple, keep it straightforward, get 4 marks under your belt and get on with the rest of the paper. So question 2 is about language. Okay, same as question 3 on paper 2. So this is the skill that is tested across both papers. And so it's really important that you get it right. So what the exam board is looking for is the quality of comment on the effect of language. So they want to know what the impact of the writer's choices are on the reader. That's what where the focus is. So you'll have the focus section reproduced at the top in your question booklet. So make sure you stick to the section. However, we would expect you to show that you understand how this section links to the impressions or the ideas we get elsewhere. So if it was focused on a character, you might say, you know, these verbs here da, 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 all contribute to the overall impression of the character as. So showing that you're aware that these happen in context. So you need to identify the subject of the question. That's really key. The question will give you a particular focus for those lines. So it might be a character, it might be the setting, it might be an atmosphere or something like that. Then identify interesting details in that little passage. Okay, we expect you to write on these. So when you've then been given the focus, find the interesting details, find the words and the phrases that you could say something about. And once you've done that, then think about the methods used. Just because there's a metaphor in there, if you can't think of anything intelligent to say about the metaphor, don't write about it. Pick an interesting word and just talk about the interesting effects of that word. It's always more important that you can talk about the effect of it rather than identify it. And for effect, think about what the writer is trying to do in this section or in this text and explain how these small details support this bigger idea. So if the writer is trying to make us feel sympathy for a character, how do those words help make us feel sympathetic? If the writer is trying to show a contrast between something, how do those words build that contrast? So always think about what the writer is trying to do and how those words help them do it. That's how you get to the effect. And one of the more sophisticated things, so for those of you aiming for band 4s in this, see if you can find patterns and build them up. Can you connect different examples together? So you might pick the use of this word, and this word from 3 different lines all contribute to the effect of da, 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 da. Okay, so try to think about not necessarily just looking at a word in isolation, but looking at the overall impact of language choices as well and how they can build up an effect. Because sometimes one of the dangers is if you take a word out of context, it can mean something different to what it means in the sentence in the text. So be really clear about how the word works in this text rather than just going for a dictionary definition. So our examiner's view is really key that you only need to make 1 or 2 points done well. Okay, if you show the skill level, you will get that mark. So if you write one paragraph that shows a clear understanding of language, you will get 5 marks. What a lot of people do is go over their time writing 3 or 4 paragraphs that are all level 3, and so at most they're eligible for 6 marks. And so they've used a huge amount of time to get 1 extra mark, and sometimes you've got to be kind of clever about how you're going to use your time. So, for example, here you can see by describing the jeweller's shops as metaphorical fairy palaces, the writer shows just how interesting but also out of reach these shops are for Rosabelle, as they are just as out of reach for a poor shop girl like herself as they would be if they were entirely imaginary. Thus, the writer is ensuring our sympathy with Rosabelle later in the extract, as we understand how frustrating it must be to look at all the wonders of the world and constantly feel excluded from them. So that's an example, part of a response, not the whole thing. But our examiners tell us that this makes connections, so you can see the key focus of this fairy palace is the identifying it using the terminology of metaphorical, but it's also really focused on the effect. It's showing how they are, how interesting and how out of reach, and then connects that to later on in the extract, so we can see how that one little phrase is contributing to the overall purpose of the text. So this comes from a band 4 full mark response, and you can see how it starts to build up those skills. This is from the examiner's report for question 2. So this idea of students can often be as successful writing about the effect of a specific word choice as writing about complex language features. Some students really want to show off that they've learned some fancy terms. If you can't say anything about it, don't write about it. I would also really caution against alliteration, because outside of poetry, alliteration can be quite difficult to say anything intelligent about, and you just end up stuck in a dead end somewhere. So just finding an interesting word or interesting phrase, often the more successful approach. This second bullet point is really important. The need to contextualize the selection in relation to the passage has been understood by many centres, but not all. Some students explored the effect, so this is for a paper a couple of years ago. Some students explored the effect of thin, but then went on to say he was fat because he was sprawling. So not looking at how the whole thing builds together. A lot of students end up contradicting themselves because all they're looking at is isolated words, and that's why I'm saying you have to think about what it's doing in that sentence, what it's doing in that paragraph, what it's doing in the whole text. If all you do is look at a random word, you can't possibly talk clearly about the effect of it because you're not focusing on the text as a whole at the same time. The best you would be able to do is sum there, okay, which is band 2. Also, one of the bullet points for this question is about sentence length and punctuation. Personally, I would avoid that. Just write about the words and phrases. Sentence length becomes very difficult to write intelligently about, and quite often is just saying there's a long sentence which makes it feel like it's going on for a long time. It's really hard to say something really perceptive about it. It's much easier to be able to say really clever things about the words and phrases used. So question 3 is the structure question, and this one often causes people quite a lot of problems. So these are some of the examples of structural features that you will be familiar with, that you've been given. Also, obviously, repetition, juxtaposition, contrast, etc. also come under this. But our examiner's view is fundamentally to answer these 3 questions. What changes in the text? When does it change? And why does it change? And really, that's all it needs. A lot of people really overcomplicate the structure question and then end up either retelling the whole story and getting 2 marks because you're basically narrating, or spending so long trying to say something clever that you've then made life more difficult for yourself elsewhere. So if you fundamentally answer these 3 questions, what changes, when does it change, and why does it change, and particularly why does it change there, that will actually stand you in far better stead for this question. But what are we looking for when we're looking at this structure question? So firstly, just like language, the most important thing is the quality of the effect of the writer's choices. So what does that choice do to the reader is what you have to show. We've been encouraged in the past that level 4 students particularly need to try and aim to have this sense of overview. So if you're one of our high achievers, you're looking for something, you really want to push yourself with this question, think about having a few sentences at the beginning that establish the overall sort of shape or direction of the text without turning it into narrative. It's a really hard juggling act to manage, but it's showing an overall understanding of the way the text has been structured. So you might say, the text initially establishes a quite melancholy tone, but then about halfway through shifts suddenly into a more positive description as we see. So you can see how you're looking at the tone or the style that's being established to help you with structure. You need to try to justify what the details are doing in that place in the text. So this is all about the order and the organisation of the text. So why is it that you put that there? So if you were building a house and you put the door on the second floor, that wouldn't be much use. So why does the door have to be on the ground floor? What's it do there? It allows you to enter into the building. So what is the entrance into this text? How does it develop? Where do we go next? Sometimes it might be helpful to think of it as a film clip, so in the more sort of cinematic approach. So what would we be focusing on at various points in the action? Where would we have to have more detail? Where are we getting dialogue? When does someone enter or exit? So imagine it brought to life. That may help you, but obviously don't write about it as if it's a film clip. So also, again, really key, this question is often really overwritten. A couple of points done well is absolutely fine. You do not have to write about everything that happens in the text. A lot of students never get past the opening of the text, and that's not terribly helpful quite often. So you need to think about where you're going to focus your time. So here we've got an example. This is an example of the sort of overview. The writer has structured this text to gradually introduce the severe difficulties being caused in Alex's family by his mother's illness. However, this information is only revealed halfway through the text, when the writer includes the key line of, instead, the reader is initially focused on Alex's dream, the true meaning of which only becomes clear when... So you can see here lots of focus on how things have been organised. It shows an understanding of the whole text, what it's trying to do, and some of the key points of change that the writer has used in order to create an impact. So the examiner's report tells us that answers with complex technical terms are often less successful than answers that just tell us why the thing you're writing about is effective at that point in the text. Don't make this more difficult than it needs to be. A lot of revision guides and a lot of videos online will tell you lots and lots of fancy terminology for structure, very little of which is often very helpful. So really keep focused on what it is you can say about how it's been organised. No one's looking for ridiculous terminology. Shift, focus, change, they're all terminology for this question. That's how you can still hit that third bullet point. We often get students who end up writing about language. And I say, at the beginning, the writer uses this phrase, and then it's a language question. So, and you don't pick up any points for that. So you get students who write a lot that doesn't really get much credit at all. We still have people talking about this helps to interest the reader or engage the reader or makes the reader want to read on. And also, those of you who have come up with interesting synonyms for that, compelling the reader to continue or something, we see through that. It's still just saying it makes the reader want to read on. That doesn't tell us why we want to read on. And so it's stuck at level 1. It's limited. Okay. So you have to explain in much more clarity why it makes the reader want to read on. So this whole idea of the connections between things is really key. So students are more successful if they note a structural feature at a specific point in the text and then comment on how it is developed from earlier or how it contrasts with the start or the end. So that's what I'm saying about what changes. So if you talk about what changes at a certain point, then you're establishing, well, we're going from this to that for this reason, for this impact, and that will hit you the marks really effectively. If you look at it in isolation, you can't really talk about structure. Structure requires you to be able to build up connections between the text. There is a bullet point which says, how is the writer structured this to interest you? Don't just tell me what you find interesting in the text. Some students misinterpret that. So just be careful with that bullet point. So the examiner's views on this section. This question steals people's time. Write one solid point, like I said for language, and then see what the time is. There's only 8 marks available for structure. So one really good point could get you 5 or 7 marks, and then you can keep moving. A lot of people fill the pages for structure and don't really say anything. And so it becomes a huge waste of time. So make sure you're saying one good point and get on with it. Do not retell the story. Your examiner has read the story. They know what's in it. They want to know how it's been constructed. They want something behind the scenes. I find this a very good strategy that was recommended to me from an examiner's meeting, which I think might be very helpful for you. So maybe aim for 2 paragraphs. So 1, where is there a significant change in the text? Why is it there and what does it do? So you go, at this point, we suddenly have a character enter, or there is a revelation, or the tone changes or something like that. What is it doing at that point and why is it effective? And then how are we prepared for the ending? So the exam board have decided very closely that this extract is going to end here. So what is it about that ending that is significant, and how are we prepared for it, or how are we feeling at the end of it? And how are we built up to that ending? Those will both focus on structure. They will stop you retelling the story, and they stop you from beginning at the beginning and just going, in the beginning it does this, in the middle it does that. This will give you a much closer focus on structure. So I would really recommend you practice with those 2 paragraphs and see how you find it. And quite often, really helpful for structure is to think about tone. So what tone is established? How does it change? What's the tone at the end? And again, this helps you stop narrating. So you can say the writer ensures that at the end of the text, we're left with a very melancholy feeling as having built up from. And that forces you again to not just retell the story, but try and get into a bit more analysis of what's going on. Next is question 4, is your evaluation. I should say there is no necessity for you to do the questions in question order. My personal recommendation would be to read the text, read question 5, so you can start thinking about that a bit, and then I personally would go and do questions 1, 2, 3, 4, and then finish with question 5. I think it's important to do the reading section in order. Going straight in at question 4 is quite a risk, because normally you'll have practiced writing about it and thought about the text for quite some time before you get to question 4. So it might be a little harder to use your time efficiently. If you're someone who really struggles with timing, I would personally perhaps start with question 5, get that done, and then go and do the other ones so that you're not missing out a load of time for such a high tariff question. So question 4, I put an example 1 up here for you. What's really key to begin with is making sure you understand what the question is asking. So a student will have an opinion, okay? And often it comes in 2 parts. So here you've got the villagers are clearly entertained by the event. The writer really brings the scene to life. So they are 2 different things. One, it's asking you, do you think that the villagers are clearly entertained by the event? Look at your impressions. Do you agree? And the second one is asking you to go, well, do they really bring the scene to life, or is it not that effective? And the bullet points will link to that if you think about it carefully. Okay, but really important is that you identify what the focus of the question is. So here you've got 2 different parts, and that's almost always the case. Now, you do not have to agree with the statement. Some people will advise you of that. Sometimes the statement is written so that it is actually rather hard to agree with, and you get good students tying themselves in knots thinking they have to agree and they must be wrong if they disagree. So you might agree, you might disagree, or you might go somewhere in the middle. You might go, well, I can see how you might think this, but also, and you might also have different responses to different parts of the question. So you might, for example, agree that one character is a horrible person, but that doesn't necessarily mean that you sympathise with another character. You can disagree with different parts. So it often comes in two parts, deal with it as such. And you need to think about, okay, what is your opinion? And that is genuinely what you're being asked for. This isn't necessarily a trick. It's being asked, right, what are your ideas? And then you need to figure out how the writer has made you think that. So before you read the text, you had no opinion on these characters or this scenario whatsoever. At the end, hopefully you have got some opinion, and you have to go, okay, so what is it that has made me sympathise with this character? What is it that shows me that this really feels vivid and like it's really alive? What's the bit in the text that's done that for me? There aren't specific marks for terminology, but there are marks for talking about the writer's methods. You can't get in the top half of the band unless you write about methods. So identifying what methods and techniques, so is it the use of vivid imagery, is it the use of a metaphor, is it the structure, is it the characterization, is it the setting? What is it that is making you think that? You can include an intro that identifies your argument if you want to, but it's not necessary, so either way. So you could go, I agree with this, but I disagree with that, just to establish at the beginning that you're clearly addressing the question. Tentative language is really helpful here. It could suggest, it may be, perhaps the writer is, you're looking at your interpretation rather than going, this is the right answer and nothing else shall be accepted. So from the report, quite a lot here, so bear with me. So the key skill for question 4 is the evaluation of both the ideas in the source in relation to the given statement and the methods used. Now, this question is a trick question because methods isn't normally explicitly identified in the question, but you have to write about methods to be able to get the good marks. So you need to write down on the top of your question 4, as soon as you get in there, methods in big letters to remind yourself. So this is still a bit of an area of weakness. We need to think about how it's been constructed and thinking about language, structure, techniques, whatever you like, in relation to the statement that you've been given. So this is an example from a paper from last year. So being able to identify links between things, so finding different details that are quite key are really interesting, and being able to connect them together, because that shows a really good understanding of the whole text. So for example, this one has a girl who is out with her family, and there's a little comment and suggestion that they are struggling for money, and then the father's treatment of the girl later perhaps might be modified in light of that understanding. So showing that you can pick up on little details can be quite key. Be careful, however, of, particularly if it's a text set in the past, you get a lot of students who are going, back in them days, women was expected to be seen and not heard, and therefore, and you're like, well, that's not necessarily terribly helpful. So be careful about how you're using the historical context. This question will be on the second half of the text. You'll be given a specific line to start from. You can refer to what happens earlier, obviously, but your focus and your analysis has to be on the second half of the text. Again, we see quite a lot of quite bright students do good stuff with the wrong part of the text, which limits their marks. It's not essential to include a counter-argument or to cover both halves of the statement, okay, which is quite an interesting issue. I would say that for the most able, you do need to be able to show some real development and detail, but it may be that you spend so much time analysing one section, so one part of the statement, that you don't get to the other. It's risky, but if you do it well, if you show the skills, you get the marks. I personally would always recommend you try and make sure you cover both parts of the statement, because you're ensuring the best chance of showing off your skills. What is key is that you don't have to include a counter argument. You don't have to go. On the other hand, some people might say, if you don't believe that, don't write it. If you do think that it's very ambiguous, then do put it in. But you should write about things that you actually believe. So this is from our examiner's view. Length for this question does not equal quality. 2 to 3 sides of the answer book is perfectly fine and quite often preferable. If you haven't got the marks by then when are you going to put them in? You should always start with your strongest point in this, and you need to keep an eye on the time. You've got about 20 minutes to answer this question, 20-25 minutes, which isn't that much time to figure out what you want to say, address both parts of the statement, make sure you're talking about methods. You're probably only going to make 1 or 2 points maximum for each part of the statement. If you can address each part of the statement effectively, that's 2 paragraphs. And if they're done really well, you can still get full marks. Okay, you don't have to write loads. Identify specific details and explore their impact. So again, this is like with language, like with structure. Really try and explain to me how your response to this text has been formed. And show me how the statement is or isn't true. Don't just change the question. This is key. A lot of students just decide to rewrite the question. So if you were asked, you know, I really sympathise with this character, to what extent do you agree? You get a lot of students saying, I don't sympathise with her. Actually, I find her hilarious. And then explain to me why she's funny. And I'm like, no, I want to know why you don't sympathise with her. So make sure it's a subtle difference, but it can be quite important. And you want to convince the examiner of your opinion. So on the other hand, some might say, isn't necessary unless you are really on the fence. Sometimes they are ambiguous. Sometimes you're there going, well, I can see why she reacted like that, but equally, it's not really on. That's fine. That can be a complex argument. But if you don't believe it, don't write it just because you think you have to. Because then you just feel like you're gaming the system rather than honestly expressing your opinion. So this is why it's really key to write things you believe in. If you don't believe something, don't write it. Okay? So creative writing, question 5. This is often the place most people can make up most marks, and frustratingly as a teacher, I would say it's the one that students practice least. So you all buy your revision guides and you practice the reading questions. I very rarely get given extra writing questions to mark, but it's worth half the paper. It's worth 25% of your whole GCSE, this one task. So if you're going to spend your time practicing your writing is probably more effective than anything else. So firstly, you'll be given a choice of 2 questions for question 5. So read the tasks really carefully and think before you write. You need to know what it is you're going to write about before you start. Planning and organisation in this are vital. We've just spent a load of time talking about structure and the importance of a structured story. You have to show those same skills. So knowing what the key story points are in your narrative or in your description and where it's going to go and how it's going to end before you start writing is really important. Only takes a couple of minutes, but making sure you know how the overall arc will help. If the lines blur a bit between description and narrative, don't worry too much. Try to keep your focus on the appropriate skill. But for example, there's, if you're asked to describe a place, like a seaside or something, you may need to walk around the seaside a bit in order to get loads of different things to write about. That's absolutely fine. The focus here is on the quality of writing. The examiners are seeking to support you and to credit you with what you have. So make sure that you give them the opportunity to give you as much credit as possible. Now, timing here is important. Don't write loads, but don't write too little. You can't get away with writing 2 paragraphs in this. It's 40 marks. But again, 3 to 4 sides in the answer booklet that you then go back over, proofread and edit is far better than filling the whole thing and not actually checking it in any way whatsoever. So making sure you have time to proofread. Your examiners are expecting to see editing. They're expecting to see that you've crossed words out, that you've sorted out apostrophes, that your capital letters are clear. If you see a pristine page that has no corrections on it, I personally see someone who hasn't read their own writing, and there will be mistakes in it that lose you marks. Now, the construction of this one is tricky. You will have a picture prompt and a written prompt. but either of them could be a description or a narrative. So read the task really carefully, because sometimes you get a picture prompt for a narrative task and then people just describe the picture, and really they're not fulfilling what the task is asking. And you could end up with 2 description tasks, you could end up with 2 narrative tasks. So really do make sure you know what you're being asked about, and don't just go, oh, picture, describe, and without even thinking about it. So our examiner really wants to see shorter, well-written responses. Waffling and just not knowing how to end your story is a dreadful experience for someone to mark, and often ends up with you losing marks. In the reading section, if you show a skill, you get that level. With the writing section, because it's a holistic approach, if the second half of it is dreadful, then the overall piece of writing isn't clear, and therefore you can't get into band 3. So really be careful about not writing yourself out of marks because you feel like you ought to keep going. Spending time improving what you've written is often a more efficient use of your time than expanding what you've written. So from the report, firstly, be careful with words. Again, some students get really self-conscious about their vocabulary and therefore try to use these wow words without really understanding them, and sometimes overcomplicating things. We're going through a period at the moment where no one's allowed to just use the word blue. It has to be aquamarine or azure or turquoise or something. Sometimes blue is blue, okay, that's okay. So don't think every word has to be fancied up. Examiners don't live under a rock. We know what's in the cinemas, we know what's popular on TV and things, and it is always painfully obvious when someone has just stolen a plot, mostly as much as anything else because it doesn't fit the task. I know that creative writing can be stressful, but you can't just plagiarise, okay? It's not a good idea. Planning's important, but don't let it run away either. You've got to find a balance. About 5 minutes organising your ideas and getting your ideas straight before you start is key. AO6 has 16 marks available for technical accuracy. So ensure things like the accurate use of apostrophes, semicolons and colons a few times is preferable to just sticking an apostrophe at the end of every word in case you're getting it right or not. That doesn't show you know how to use it. You need to be careful with colons and semicolons. People get quite enthusiastic about them, and particularly exclamation marks. You don't need to use them that much. You need to extend your use of varied punctuation, sentences and paragraphs. Correct spellings, getting homophones right, so there and there, 2 and 2. Those basics you have to get right. You are not going to pick up much credit for technical accuracy if you are mistaking there and there. And making sure you've got short and long sentences that you used correctly. If you've got speech in there, that you're punctuating it properly, that you're paragraphing properly. All those basics are worth 16 marks. Okay, so it's a really high tariff, and it's important that you practice, and this is why you should be practicing your writing tasks at home. So for question 5, just ensure that you're thinking about how structure is key. Make sure it's got a clear ending rather than just stopping. So even if you're ending on a cliffhanger, make sure that you have clearly built to that and are stopping there rather than just having the paper taken away from you. And think about the scope of the story as well. So keep it short, small and focused. Don't go overboard with it. Make sure that you're thinking about a clear little idea that's manageable in the 35-ish minutes that you've got to write. And that links to the next one, which is that interesting pieces aren't necessarily groundbreaking, so use your own experiences. We get a lot of students who try to write about air hijackings and bank heists and foiled drug rings and things, and it becomes silly. You can't really do that in 35 minutes. Whereas one of the most beautiful pieces I've read in recent years was a little girl whose mum was a couple of minutes late to pick her up from school, and it started off all sad, and then she started to ended up dancing around the car park in her wellies in all the puddles, and it was joyous and lovely, and it was very small and very everyday, but it was so beautifully written, and it really evoked that sense of atmosphere and tone. And it's really important to think about whether you've got some sort of tone change in there, particularly for the descriptive task. So if you're doing the writing to describe, if you start with a stormy weather, have the weather improve. If you're starting at night time, what happens when day breaks? So it shows that you've got some conscious crafting in there and that you can manipulate your vocabulary and your writing in order to create a different tone and experience. So that can be really helpful for you for structuring those descriptive pieces. Your examiner is looking to see improvements and adaptations. As I say, when I see a pristine piece of paper, that just rings alarm bells. So you should be building in the time to go back and improve. That should be part of the task. It should not be something you do if you have time. It's an absolutely necessary part of things. And really key is to think about the tone and atmosphere you want to create. So if you want it to be spooky and mysterious, how are you creating that? If you want it to be joyous and vibrant, how are you doing that? It will really help you to think about the effect you want to have on the reader and then show that you're adapting for that. And that's what we often see in the best pieces of writing. And finally, just a reminder, the picture is a stimulus. It's not required. So if you don't like it, you don't have to use it at all. So if you were given a task like describe a beach as suggested by this picture, if you don't like the picture that you've been given, describe a different beach. You might pick one or two ideas that you like from it and then invent the rest. That's fine. You might use the whole thing. All of them can lead to top mark answers. But what's important is that you're writing something you actually want to write. So if you want to shift it and change it and turn it into something else, then do so. You don't have to stick to it just because it's there. Okay. So there are our best sort of top tricks for paper 1. Make sure you're practicing. Make sure you're reading. Those are the best things that you can do to ensure that you're improving, but do take into account some of the tips and tricks in here, which hopefully will help you out.